Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. God, be merciful to me. Help thou my unbelief. Let me see in him that thou would have me see in my fellow man. Let me see in my brother that I see in him whom I worship. What is an ideal? We are told that a mental concept or that conceived as a standard of perfection is an ideal. Mind is the builder. We are ever striving towards something to worship or something to love, be it physical, mental, or spiritual. From our experiences we form ideas. Then through the action of imagination we sometimes confuse these ideas with ideals. An ideal is something beyond and above us toward which we build. To bind ourselves by calling our ideas ideals means the beginning of decay in the soul structure which we have builded. Our ideals are ever present, they are either consciously or unconsciously the basis for the motivating forces in our lives. The ideal lever is that each entity fulfill that purpose for which it has entered any given experience. But as has been indicated, first find self and what the ideal is. And as to whether this is of a selfish or a universal nature. In giving advice or counsel, in directing the activities in the present, all of these should be taken into consideration. For, there is naturally builded in the character, in the abilities, in the latent and manifested desires, purposes of the soul. These purposes are the latent and manifested ideals through those judgments and choices of that phase of human experience of portions of the mind. Thus they are a part of the warp or woof of an individual entity. In considering such plans, ideas and ideals, much thought, much preparation should be made on the part of each would they become the channel for carrying out such plans, such ideas, such ideals. For there oft seemeth a way to be right unto a man, but the end thereof is death. In considering an idea and an ideal, ideas are worthy of man's consideration, but ideals are something more, they must be that as may be sought for, lived each day, each hour of each day, would they become not a Frankenstein to those that foster same. For the spirit is willing in each, and there is that ability in each to carry forward much as is here set forth, but unless each has so consecrated their lives, their activities, their intents, their purposes to the ideal, they will but destroy that which would make for a building of the purposes in the lives of others. As to the abilities of the entity, as has been indicated, these are limited only by the ideals and purposes. For as we find, an entity at times who works very hard with an idea and then loses its hold on the idea, for it has lost sight of an ideal. Then, first find self and its relationships with creative forces. Trust in the abilities of self, don't trust too much in the opposite sex where questions are behind their ideals. What ideal is meant in the statement by keeping an ideal, not an idea, an ideal, before self? An ideal means that to which the entity may, itself, ever look up, knowing itself to be gradually becoming a portion, but never may it be the whole. Something to look up to, or to attempt to attain to. Not an idea, that I may do this or I may do that I may accomplish such and such through such modes of operation. For then one reaches the goal. An ideal is that as is sought by, and developed to be, at an at-one-ment with same, a portion of same, but never the whole. The entity seeks knowledge of every form or manner, and it is well, but to know to do and not to do it is sin. And thus, as ye use that in hand is more given thee. For, life itself is the manifestation of that creative force or influence ye would call God. Study, then, to show thyself approved unto an ideal. What is an ideal? This ye must first determine in thine self. Choose that most in keeping with thy purposes, thy aims, thy desires. Are thy desires and thy purposes ideal in thine own consciousness? What is thy ideal, spiritually? Then from that may be gained the ideal mentally. And the material is the outgrowth of those two. Thus may ye come to know thyself and thy relationship to thy creative forces, as ye choose those directions that the manner in which ye treat thy brother is the manner in which thy growth is attained. For God being life, spirit in action, not that which is created by man's ideas, or even man's ideals, but is man's highest ideal. In the application does the seeker find that which answers to that it has set as its ideal, that it may worship, that it may become one within its consciousness, in its sphere. To be sure, others have apparently had ideals and have fallen far short of living up to such ideals. Yet it behooves the entity to realize that ideals cannot be set in an individual or in material things, but as indicated must be founded in spiritual concept. 4. Whatever materializes into material action between individuals arises from the individual attempting to gratify a desire latent or manifested within. These, to be sure, are oft misconstrued in the experiences of individuals and thus cause or bring about hurts, disappointments as has been experienced. In giving that as may be constructive in the experience of the entity at this time, who is to say as to whether an entity has advanced or made use of the opportunities from any given period? Rather it is expedient that there be, by the entity, an analysis of self and self's motives, self's desires. As may be judged by those that are the ideals of the entity, materially, socially, mentally, spiritually. And if the entity has not measured up to that which is its ideal, then the corrections must be within self. First, then, study within self. Know what are the motivative forces, whether they be prompted by self-preservation, self-glorification, self-indulgences, or by those true influences that the entity will determine in self, by the grace of the creative forces, to make the world its world a better place for its having lived in same. Then measure the standard, not measure self by self, but as to the standard set in the one as exemplifies God in the flesh.